So thank you very much. I guess we have a presentation coming up at some point. There we go, excellent. So design has been both hero and villain in the evolution of our cities and societies. It's been responsible for many of the things that have brought great beauty and great nobility to our lives, but it's also been responsible for dehumanizing and alienating in many ways also. I guess what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this afternoon is how I believe that design is evolving in the 21st century, how it's reinventing itself or being reinvented because of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. If we take the definition of design that was created by the great scientist Herbert Simon in the 1960s, he described design as everyone who designs is somebody who devises a course of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. In other words, our desire to improve the state of the world around us is what causes us to design. And we've been designing for tens of thousands of years. The very first people who decided to craft tools to help them live their lives were in fact designers. But what's emerged is really a sort of a single approach to what design is. As we've evolved over the centuries, design has become perhaps perceived as being a more singular thing that's performed by an elite group of people in a very particular way. And that way is this idea that we can somehow create a vision of the future, that our role as designers is to create a vision of the future and then cause that vision to come to pass, to exist. That works quite well in the situation of relatively simple things. So in this instance, of a town square, we might imagine that we can do that we might imagine that indeed we can have a vision of how that town square or city square ought to be, and we can bring that vision to life, and we can imagine how that vision might play out over many years, in this case, maybe more than 100 years. But we've discovered that when we move to things of more complexity, such as the city itself, that idea starts to break down. That idea that we can have a vision, a complete vision of what the city could be, and that we can then bring that city to life, turns out not to be true. That approach to design turns out to fail at the large scale, because large-scale things are too complicated. They're too complex. We cannot possibly predict how everything will happen. And perhaps even more so in the 21st century, when not only are our systems large and complex, such as our cities and our economic systems and our social systems, but we have increasing amounts of volatility because of that complexity. So not only are they complex, but they're changing very fast and very often. So I think the challenge that we have is to move from a type of design that I would describe as being Newtonian. This is Sir Isaac Newton, the famous British physicist, and what he did was he described very simple rules that when we understand the state of a very simple system, we can predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. And Newton's laws work very well at the simple level, but they actually don't work at all well when things get complicated. Instead, I think we have to imagine design, instead of being top-down and predictive in the way that Newton would encourage us to think, instead, I think design has to evolve to become something that's emergent and evolutionary and constantly changing, something that follows more of the principles of Charles Darwin, a sort of an evolutionary approach to design. And I think we can perhaps describe two metaphors or two activities in design that perhaps describe this shift from one to the other. If the blueprint is an example of this Newtonian top-down approach to design. The blueprint is an attempt to describe every last finished decision about the design and freeze it in time. That we can think of as a Newtonian approach. Whereas code, in this case software code, is something that's emergent and evolutionary. It's something that determines a behavior but does not necessarily define the outcome. So what I'm trying to describe here is a shift in sentiment, a shift in mindset in terms of how we go about design. One important component of that shift in sentiment is, I believe, that we have to move from the notion of design being something that belongs to an elite, that's practiced by an elite, a professional elite, and instead one that in which design is embedded in every aspect of our culture and our society. We may still have, and we will still have, extremely talented master designers, but we have to have the tools of design available to everybody. We have to have the tools of design in order to operate within our lives. We have to use design as a skill just like we use literature, writing, mathematics, other basic skills and thinking skills in our lives. So we have to imagine how design becomes embedded in culture and in society. As Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired magazine, put it a little while ago, if we're in a world where everybody is a designer, is forced to be a designer, then we need to find ways for everybody to get good at it. I believe one of the roles, indeed, of master designers is, in fact, to be teachers as well as doers. That we should be describing our ideas and our methods and our approaches in the world so as to encourage others to do what we do as designers. And there are new ways of doing that. Teaching once was the master and apprentice, a very personal relationship, and that still remains an important way of teaching. But we have new ways of teaching because of new technologies. This is an example. We recently ran a design thinking program over several weeks for social entrepreneurs and social innovators, in which we had 5,000 teams around the world participate in a design program, all done remotely. So we have many mechanisms now for exploring, teaching design and design thinking in new ways, and embedding it in society. But there are other ways that this emergent, evolutionary idea of design is beginning to appear and beginning to be important, largely based on technology, largely based on a shift in the way that we communicate and the shift in the way that we act together in society. Something described very well by Stephen Johnson in his book, Future Perfect, where he talks about the rise of peer networks and phenomena such as the shared economy, where now, instead of relying on a hierarchy between producer and consumer, we are now seeing aspects and examples in society and in economies of us being both producers and consumers. This is often described as the sharing economy. This is one example of a sharing economy business, which is a rental car business, but where the cars that you rent is your neighbor's car. It is not a car provided by Hertz or Dollar or any other car rental company. It is your neighbor's car who rents the car through an internet application. This evolution of the way that we communicate and the way that we interact is based on an evolution of the networks in which we use. Our old industrial notion of networks are those that are on the left, networks that are often centralized or slightly decentralized, but still rely on this concentration of power, concentration of influence. But our networks today look like the network on the right. It's called a barren network, and it's the way in which the internet itself is developed and designed so that it's very robust, but it means every element on the network can speak to and interact with every other element. And it's this ability that we have to do that today through the internet that opens up new possibilities in terms of how we interact and how we achieve things together. And it's having an impact on design. We're seeing new ways of designing emerge because of the existence of these networks. And some simple examples, things like Pinterest, which has now taken what was once the skill of the designer to use visual materials to inspire themselves and others, is now available to everybody. And so now we can get visual inspiration from a tool like Pinterest from many people all over the world. Or Kickstarter, which enables somebody who wishes to raise capital in order to do something creative to raise that capital very easily. No longer are we reliant on traditional sources of capital, venture capitalists, banks, investment bankers, or corporations. We now see individual creative people or small creative teams raising large amounts of money in order to compete directly with the world's largest corporations. So what we're seeing is the democratization of very many elements of the process of design because of these new kinds of networks. We see something like Etsy, which is a marketplace for people to sell and distribute their creative output. Again, it allows some craftsman or some designer in one part of the world to sell their products anywhere in the world. This was not possible just a few years ago. We have platforms like Code for America, which is allowing software engineers to gain access to open data solutions from governments and redesign the way we interact in civic society. So now we're having open source approaches to the design of government. We have open design platforms. This is one that we run at IDEO that's called Open IDEO, where we have 50,000 designers around the world participating in design challenges that are socially based, where we're finding that very many different kinds of people with different insights and different skills can participate in different parts of the design process. It's opening up the design process to people in a way that's not been possible before. And we're seeing new technologies in the way that we make things, 3D printing being one example, that's making it possible to change how we imagine the relationship between design and manufacturing. Now, whereas in the 20th century, design was often disassociated from manufacturing. Design happened, and then the design went to some part of the world where large-scale manufacturing brought that design to life. We are now able to connect design and manufacturing much more closely together. We're able to iterate, we're able to go through the design and making cycle much faster, which means designs evolve faster. We get to new and interesting solutions more quickly, and we can imagine how to bring manufacturing back into our society and back into our culture in new ways. We're seeing new kinds of manufacturing companies emerge. This is a company in the United States called Local Motors that is crowdsourcing the design of vehicles and then building micro factories to assemble those vehicles in small local factories to support and to serve small local markets. So instead of having the car dealership in your local town, you have the car factory in your local town. We're seeing design emerge in the way that we think of the evolution of the fabric of our cities themselves. This is on the left, we might think of this as an example of the way design has played a role in our urban infrastructure or our urban fabric, this notion of planning. But what we see on the right-hand slide is something that's a phenomenon that's emerged in cities, started off on the west coast of America, is now spread around the world, called placemaking, where local residents take over elements of their urban environment and redesign them to make them places that are more valuable to the local community. And so by putting the tools of design into the hands of local residents, we start to see new kind of urban fabric emerging that's not planned, it's emergent. And so we might think of this evolution of design from one that's top-down, based on Newtonian principles, to one that's bottom-up, based on biological or Darwinian principles, following very much in line with the evolution of our economy over the last 200 years. That if in the 19th century what we were doing was exploiting the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, and in the 20th century we were exploiting mass media to create our consumer economy, I believe that in the 21st century we have the opportunity to exploit these new tools of design, these new technologies, these new kinds of networks, and to end up with something that might be described and was described by the futurist Paul Sappho as the creator economy, and an economy in which we are all both designers, creators, producers, and consumers. Thank you very much.